This is a production of Cornell University.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it. And as Tony said, I have been working for the last 4.5 years on a variety of projects, all sort of within this theme of developing perennial grain cropping systems and even the market opportunities that Tony briefly mentioned. So a good mix of agronomy and environmental science and even economics. But we'll get into that a little bit more throughout the presentation. So just to give you a brief outline of what we'll discuss today, I want to provide a brief overview of ecological solutions to agricultural challenges to set the stage, then introduce you to the opportunities and challenges of perennial grain crops, which are new, but have a lot of promising aspects in terms of sustainability. I'll then discuss two of my research projects. One where we were looking at intercropping perennials and annuals with medium red clover, and another where we were trying to mitigate a known yield decline in one of these perennial crops using strip tillage in a more mature stand. Then I'll just touch on some conclusions and ways that we might move forward with perennial grains research before opening it up for questions at the end. So everyone here is likely pretty familiar with some of the major challenges to agricultural sustainability, particularly from an environmental perspective, which is what we'll largely focus on here today, although my interests do span into the areas of social and economic sustainability as well. So here on the right, we have a figure that might be familiar to some, sort of portraying the planetary boundaries in certain areas. So these are areas where, as scientists, there's some agreement that we are exceeding the carrying capacity of our planet. And some of those areas might be nutrient pollution, usage of fresh water, land system change, and all the effects that has on biodiversity and ecosystem function, climate change, of course, and then some areas that we're really not quite as clear on at this point. And what I'll point out here is anywhere where you're seeing it going into the red, we're anticipating that we've already exceeded some of these boundaries, and we need to do something immediately to try to mitigate and find solutions to these issues. And then I would also note with this diagram in particular, anywhere that has this sort of speckling is sort of the estimate of how much agriculture contributes to these problems. So you can see, especially in the areas that are outside in the red zone, agriculture is having quite a large effect on ecosystems and the sustainability of our planet. And so to just discuss a few of those, our current industrialized agriculture has many issues of soil loss and degradation over time, water and air pollution due to nutrient runoff and greenhouse gas emissions. As I mentioned, land use change, so deforestation and the shifting agriculture when we do run into issues of soil degradation, for example. A high reliance on synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and fossil fuels, which over the long term will not be sustainable as those resources become more limited, and as things like pesticide resistance develop further. Freshwater availability in some areas of the world is becoming a challenge to agriculture. And then sort of the overall encompassing threat of climate change and how we might adapt our systems to still be productive, but also resilient in the face of climate change. And then sort of I've put in this bar to sort of separate some of the areas that we think that perennial grains might contribute versus some other things like food security and other social and economic issues, which are heavily entwined in these issues, but might not be solved by simply growing a crop that has some different characteristics. And so in particular with food security, I'll highlight that there because as I'll mention in a few slides, perennial grains currently do yield less food, grain, than comparable annuals. And so that is one of the drawbacks currently, and is something that is informing a lot of the research that we're trying to do to both increase those yields, but also think about how we might balance the contributions of food versus other services, environmental or other ways we can use the crop. So broadly, it has been suggested that to counteract some of these threats to agricultural sustainability, we might be able to restore ecosystem services to croplands. So the concept of ecosystem services, which really became popular after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment back in 2005, really focuses on the things other than material goods that we can, well, including material goods, but other material goods and other services we can get from our ecosystems, the many ways that human society is supported by the natural world. So in these panels, we can sort of think about a couple different systems. So in a natural ecosystem, which is maybe modified by humans, but is not designed for agricultural production, there may be some amount of food and other crop available. So you can think about foraging in these contexts, or fisheries or things like that. But there's many other services that are widely available. So forest production, natural habitat and biodiversity, water, air quality. But when we change those ecosystems into an intensively managed cropland, we can really increase the amount of food or fiber that we produce from those systems. But we're losing a lot of those other services by simplifying the system, by going down to monocultures, heavily managed, relying on external inputs, as I mentioned earlier. And in some cases, you can see these bubbles are small, so suggesting that there might be services in some areas. Some areas, there's actually disservices. So for example, water quality might be impaired by an intensive cropland if there's a lot of runoff or nutrient pollution. So really, in thinking about perennial grains, they sort of fit into this area of cropland with restored ecosystem services, where we're trying to balance out. We're still trying to have a highly productive agro-ecosystem, but balance out some of those services by diversifying and thinking about new ways of managing our croplands. So we might not get the same magnitude of crop production, but we're restoring a lot of these other services that we can get. And focusing on perennial grains, there's a lot of opportunity at this moment in time. So one thing to think about is that annual grain crops take up about 70% of total global cropland and account for about 70% of human food calories if you account for both direct consumption and animal feed. And that's costly if we think from an environmental perspective, if we think about all those detriments of intensive cropland environmentally on the previous slide. But with recent advances in breeding and biotechnology, perennial grains are really reaching the point where they could be commercially viable. And there is a mounting support both amongst the agricultural community and consumers to have more multifunctional agriculture that can provide things other than just food and calories. And then finally, there has been some research done showing evidence for perennial crops as part of an integrated cropping system being more resilient and adaptive to climate change. And then on top of all of that, there's been a big push both from the food industry and from research funders to support some of these projects, seeing that these certain perennial grains are right on the cusp of breaking into the market. One in particular that I've worked with and you'll hear about a lot is kernza, or a type of intermediate wheatgrass that has been put into the first commercial food product available, this long root ale from Patagonia Provisions. Also Cascadian Farms, which is an organic branch of General Mills, has really jumped on to kernza and is in R&D with breakfast cereals. They did a Kickstarter campaign with one of those. Cereal bars, other products. One of their goals, like ultimately that they've stated, is to have kernza in your Cheerios, in your breakfast cereal at some point in the future. So they really do see the value of this, both to diversify what they're using in their supply chain, but also to satisfy certain commitments they've made for corporate sustainability. From a research funding perspective, you might have seen things like this Cornell Chronicle article about a grant that Matt and other collaborators received recently. We have here a picture of kernza bread from Wide Awake Bakery from one of our research projects. We also just recently, in the last couple months, learned of a 10 million USDA CAP grant going towards the development of a Kernza consortium across many institutions. And so there's a lot of momentum in this area. And so it really does provide an opportunity to make a difference. And just to iterate, these are all of the institutions that, at least in 2018, were working on perennial grain development. And so here we are in, in Cornell. So to get into a little bit more detail about why perennial grains have all these environmental benefits, one thing to note is having crops in the ground year round, and many of these perennials have more extensive root systems than annuals to aid in their persistence, can really contribute to soil health. So here in this diagram, thinking about a potential crop rotation of perennials with annuals, after several rotations of annual crops where the soil may have been somewhat depleted of organic matter, planting a perennial that over its 3, maybe 5 to 10 year lifespan can contribute to restored soil health. There's not less tillage during that period. There's more opportunity for crop biomass to go back into the soil. Can restore that soil health and lead to an overall cycling of soil health throughout time in this rotation. Another potential use is in areas that are particularly prone to erosion, or areas where infiltration could be important. So here you see an annual crop, which is allowing most of the water, especially in the off season. So after the crop's been harvested and there's just stubble remaining, there's a lot of potential for soil detachment and erosion, and less potential for that water to actually infiltrate back into the groundwater, versus a perennial, which throughout the year has green biomass growing and roots deep into the soil. There'll be much less runoff and also the potential for higher infiltration. And then you can think a little bit further than just the perennial crop on its own here on the left. There might be potential for things like grazing and dual purpose use, which I'll mention, but also the possibility of perennial polycultures and how diversifying within the field can add to things like pollinator or even other wildlife habitat. And so you could see of this as a continuum from the monoculture perennial to maybe a dual crop of a perennial cereal and a perennial legume, to a completely integrated system that might have a variety of different plants with different functionalities. That gets a little bit more complex in terms of management. So for the focus of where I am at right now with my research, we are sort of focusing on this area here where we can think about intercropping and how you might have complementarity between a grain crop and a nitrogen fixing legume. And in general, like I said at the beginning, things like low grain yield are a challenge for perennial systems. These are new crops, and they don't have the decades, centuries of development of the cropping system, the investment in infrastructure for the market, the understanding of things like how to establish and harvest the stand. So there's a lot of agronomic challenges. There's some logistic challenges. There's things like fewer pest management options without being able to rotate crops as frequently or use tillage as a tool for weed management, for example. But there are opportunities, as I mentioned, having year-round ground cover, and those deep root systems can really help protect the water in the soil. The dual purpose use for grain and forage production in the same year. Utilizing some areas that might not be suitable for annual row cropping, areas that might be more sloped or close to bodies of water. And then there's likely some advantages in terms of fewer field operations. So by planting once and then harvesting from the same stand for many years, you can avoid having that annual cycle of tillage and replanting, which for farmers can become a bit of a crunch during that high demand period for management on the farm. So there might be some labor, there might be some energy savings as well. And so if you recall back to the title of this, we're thinking about perennial grains through a systems ecology perspective. So I created this systems diagram very early on in my time at Cornell just to help me conceptualize the system. And you could, if you took a very close look, there's probably a lot of things that are missing here. You add too many linkages between things, it starts to look like a pile of spaghetti. But basically the point is that within the system, there's the crop field itself, there's plants, there's soil, there's other organisms, there's all of the assets owned by the farmer that go into planting, harvesting, processing the crop. But then there's all these external inputs, some of which are purchased and some of which are natural. And so the balance between what's natural and renewable input can be a trade-off with some of these other purchased inputs. And the system can be supported by interactions within the system to make some of these external things more or less important in the overall production system. So you could think of things like external soil amendments being added to improve the fertility of the soil. But if the soil ecosystem is healthy enough, then there might be less need for those. So there's a lot going on here, but it's really thinking about how the system as a whole, all the pieces interact to make something that's greater than each of those individual parts. And so we don't really want to focus in just on the crop plants and how we can get the most productivity out of them. We also need to think about all these other aspects. And so here I've highlighted some areas that I've really focused on with my PhD research, thinking about soil health and how perennials might be different than annuals in that respect, how the non-crop plants, weeds, might interact with the crop plants, or you could even think of non-crop plants as things like a forage legume, which may not be providing grain yield, but is also contributing to the overall system. Obviously, we are looking at the productivity of the crop, and then the economic side of things and how a perennial at this point in its development might be economically viable for a farmer. And so I've conducted probably too many research projects. I sort of commit to a lot of things, but here I just highlight some of the things we've been looking at to try to address some of these challenges, try to provide answers, and just to better understand the system. So these first two are the ones that I'll focus on here today: intercropping with medium red clover and strip tillage renovation. We've also tried intercropping with field peas, thinking about weed management after harvest during that regrowth period in the fall, trying to figure out which herbicides might be good for use in weed management for perennial grains, also pathogens, and some more physiological work, some more soil work, and even as Tony had mentioned, the work with Miguel Gomez and others in the Dyson School, as well as collaborations with folks at Wide Awake Bakery to understand what consumers would be willing to pay for a perennial grain product, and whether they would be willing to perhaps pay more for something that has all these environmental benefits. And so I just highlight here some of our external collaborators, while everything up here has been really within Cornell, but really also supported by so many members of the DiTomaso and Ryan labs that I'll acknowledge at the end as well. And so, as I said, we'll be focusing on these two for the purposes of getting through the next 30 minutes. And so here I'll introduce you to the two perennial grain crops that we focused on. On the left is Kernza intermediate wheatgrass, or Thinopyrum intermedium, which is a wild perennial grass that for the last 40 years has been under domestication for grain production. So that started at the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania, eventually moved to the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, and really over the last 5 years or so has been one of the main perennial crops that people are interested in for the reasons I pointed out earlier: interest from the food industry. There's been a lot of momentum built up behind this crop. It does seem to be one of the more developed from a cultivar perspective. And then on the right, we have ACE1 Perennial Cereal Rye, which I contrast with Kernza as an annual grain crop that has been perennialized via hybridization. So by crossing your cereal rye, Kaylee cereal, with mountain rye, they are hoping to introgress some of those perennial genes, but maintain many of the characteristics of an annual grain crop. So things like free threshability, synchronous maturity, large seed size. Some of those actually are really what the breeders are focusing on in Kernza. So as a domestication process goes along, you're trying to make the small seed of a wild grass into something that looks like a rye or a wheat. And so I'll contrast these in how they've been developed from a cultivar perspective, but that contrast also does play out in how they perform in the field, which we'll see in a few slides. And so for the first research experiment that I conducted, intercropping perennials with annuals with clover, we started this one really thinking from that systems perspective with 5 broad research objectives. We did want to understand how much grain and crop biomass would be produced by the perennials in comparison with annuals. We wanted to understand the weed community better and identify weeds that might be problematic in these perennial systems so we could later target our management. We wanted to look at soil health, as I said, and then 2 that are grayed out here are the economic piece, which I won't talk about today, and trying to see what would a consumer need to pay for a perennial grain in order for it to break even from an economic perspective with something like a wheat. And then evaluating certain indicators of overall system sustainability. So not necessarily life cycle analysis, but if you're familiar with that concept, things of that nature, and seeing how they might compare broadly. So as I said, all of those things we're really looking at with this single field experiment. The experimental design was a randomized complete block design with 4 main plot treatments, and those were the 4 grain crops that we grew. So Kernza, the intermediate wheatgrass, ACE-1 rye, a hard red winter wheat, and then 2 varieties of malting barley, which in our colder New York climate actually didn't do too well. So eventually were dropped from the experiment. But I do want to mention them here, especially since they're in the diagram. And each of these was grown in split plots, both with and without medium red clover. So each of these plots in the field had half of it grown as a monoculture, and then half of it with the medium red clover frost seeded in March of each year for the annuals, and frost seeded in the first year for the perennials. So after growing the plants, we sampled crop and weed biomass at grain maturity for each of the species each summer. So for wheat and barley, that's earlier in July. For perennial rye, that's later in July. And Kernza, it's actually the middle of August. So that does also, by adding these to the cropping system, might diversify even the harvest window. And like I mentioned earlier, take some of the burden off of growers that often are really trying to get everything in at the same time. But by clipping the biomass and the weeds, and the weeds were sorted by species, we threshed and dehulled if necessary the grain crops. So dehulling is particularly for Kernza, which, like I said, those characteristics of domestication, it has an adherent hull, which makes it a little bit harder to process. And then all of the grain yield estimates are based on a correction to 13.5% moisture. And I'll just show a few photos just to give you an idea of what these look like in the field. So here on the left, Kernza intermediate wheatgrass about 2 months after planting, and an ACE-1 rye, which looks pretty good. I'll say actually, when I put this into PowerPoint and it gives you those little suggestions for like an alternative text, PowerPoint thought this was a train going down some tracks. So basically picking up on the fact there's not much green material here early on. And with Kernza, that's something we've learned. It's slower to establish, but once it gets going, it can produce a lot of biomass. But particularly in that first fall, it doesn't look like much. And then the next spring, about April, is when you actually start to see it fill out. And that poses some challenges for weed management during that period. That did play out a little bit going into the next spring. So you can see the Kernza is now growing pretty tall, but weeds did manage to get in there in the meantime and might be competing with the crop. But while the rye looks really good, and there's very little weed biomass under there, it was able to get up, grow tall quickly, and really exclude weeds from the system. But after harvest in that first year is when we noticed the real first contrast between, or I guess the second contrast other than establishment between these two species. So Kernza quickly regrew after harvest, and you can see it here above the clover. Um, uh, but ACE1 struggled. So it after harvest, the clover really took over and seemed to outcompete the rye in that system. And so the story after 3 years is that with clover in the Kernza, we might be seeing a visual difference. Maybe it's a little bit greener, maybe there's some extra nitrogen there, but both systems are looking pretty healthy. In contrast with ACE1 rye, both with and without clover, where with clover, the ACE1 rye was outcompeted, and there's some rye plants still there, but quite few. And without the clover, all the rye got outcompeted by other weeds that came in, and there might be even fewer plants without the clover. So really what happened with ACE1 is that it wasn't competitive in that post-harvest period, and that sort of accumulated over time. And so we didn't do any weed management in these systems. We were trying to understand some of these factors, being the first time we've grown them. But that does seem to be a critical period for weed control, and something that in other experiments has been shown to help with the persistence and productivity of the ACE1 going into a second or third year. And so for these first two objectives of looking at grain yields and weed communities, I'll just go into some of the data. With our data analysis, I'm only reporting Kernza and wheat here. For the reasons that we just saw with the ACE1, there really wasn't much to speak of into the third year, and actually not that much in the second year either. And with the winter kill of the malting barley, we had dropped that from the experiment. But we did look at crop and forage yields and weed biomass for the Kernza and wheat, analyzed it with mixed effects ANOVA. We had to log transform the data due to skewness, and had crop species intercropping and year as fixed effects. So you'll be seeing similar models for all of these treatments throughout the following slides. And we'll get to weed communities eventually, where we have an ordination to visualize it, and then Permanova and indicator species analysis to look at what's going on in more detail in those systems. So for grain yield, the main takeaways here, there was a significant crop difference between crops, and there was a significant effect by year with an interaction between the two. There was no effect of the clover intercrop on grain yield, however. And so really the story is with Kernza, it was lower than the wheat in that first year, but then declined into the second year and rebounded slightly into the third year. Whereas wheat had statistically similar yields throughout all 3 years. There might be a slight decline over time, but nothing significant there. And so really the initially lower grain yields followed by a decline is a major issue for Kernza, and something that we'll even talk about a little bit in the second experiment to address that. With forage yields, they were initially similar, but Kernza biomass tended to increase over time, while wheat biomass decreased. And so that is one area of opportunity for the perennial grains and use as a dual purpose grain and forage crop, where a grower might be able to balance out the low grain yields with high forage production if they're able to use that in the system. And I will say, as the perennials stay greener for longer into the year, through the year, they do make a much higher quality forage than something like wheat straw, which you could also harvest from a wheat field, but not as valuable. Oh, and I will say here, there was a significant effect of intercrop. And so adding clover to the system increased total forage production. And we didn't analyze forage quality, but you could, the higher protein of the forage, of a clover forage might have increased quality as well. And then when we look at weeds, really the story is that there was a difference by species. As we saw with the slow establishment of Kernza, there were weeds early on, and those tended to stay in the system throughout the 3 years. There was, again, a significant effect by year and an interaction there. I will also say that the clover did have a significant weed suppressive effect. So you can see that there's quite a lot lower weeds in the clover plots across all the systems. But the weeds increased over time. So a difference between the perennial and the annual system. There's actually been other studies with Kernza where maybe they got it established a little bit better, where weeds are suppressed by the Kernza itself over time. So that's not something we saw here, but it is another potential benefit of a perennial system that's highly competitive and persistent. And then when we took a closer look at the weed communities by species, here we have an ordination. So the axes are not that meaningful. Really what we're looking at, these centroids are sort of the central tendency of different treatments, where the closer together points are on the plot, the more similar they are in their weed communities. And so all of the green is the Kernza, both with and without clover. And then the brown or tan is the wheat. And so even here on this initial plot, you can sort of see some clustering in certain areas. But when we look at this by year, we see a definite shift in the weed communities over time. So from 2017, Kernza with and without clover both shifted along this x-axis to the right, maybe in slightly different directions. And then we also see with wheat a shift initially to the right, but then sort of back again towards the left. So this is telling us that there is divergence between the communities of weeds we're seeing in these systems. And to confirm that with the Permanova, which is really the statistical test here, we saw significant species and intercrop effects and year effects with, again, this strong interaction between year and crop, basically the perennial changing over time while the annual sort of stayed the same, maybe changed and back. And so looking at each year individually, we see that the clover intercrop had the strongest effect in that second year. And I believe that's because that's when the Kernza was really coming into its own. And then by the third year, the Kernza was starting to outcompete the clover even. When we look at indicator species, so what this indicates is that each time there's a significant p-value for a species, it means that that species is particularly prevalent on plots of that type. And so we can interpret this by looking in 2017 with Kernza and no clover, a winter annual shepherd's purse was really indicative of that cropping system, while wood sorrel was particularly indicative of the wheat no clover cropping system. And so we didn't have any significant indicators in 2018 with this data, but by 2019, we are starting to, again, see that clear separation in the systems. So with the Kernza and no clover, we are seeing a lot of perennials, some timothy and roughstalk bluegrass, perennial grasses, and then Canada goldenrod and dandelion broadleaf perennials. With wheat and clover, we were seeing a perennial sedge, yellow nut sedge, that was able to compete through that clover and come up in that system and wasn't really seen in any of the other systems. And then wheat no clover, we're start to see a broad variety of annuals, very common annuals, yellow foxtail, ragweed, and a couple of polygonums. And so here, one thing you'll notice is that with clover, there weren't any significant indicators because the clover was suppressing a lot of the weed species and sort of evening things out broadly. But without clover, we're starting to really see that divergence between a perennial and an annual weed community. Moving on to soil health. Sampling here was done each year, including a baseline collection soon after planting in 2016. After that, we always sampled after harvest, before replanting, so before the annual plots were retilled. We collected samples with golf hole cores, the relatively large diameter, and to a relatively shallow depth. And then we analyzed bulk density in the lab and then sent to the soil health lab for wet aggregate stability, soil respiration, and active carbon. And really, I'll just say this up front, there wasn't a lot of variation between the systems over time. Here with bulk density, we're seeing a slight effect by year and an interaction by year and species. So with wheat in 1 year, it might have been a little bit higher than wheat in a different year, but nothing too dramatic. With wet aggregate stability, it was only a year effect where we sort of saw a bump up and then down. And again, with soil respiration, there was simply a year effect. This might be due to different environmental conditions in year. 2018 in particular was very dry. So not a lot to read into these. With active carbon, we did see a very close, significant crop species effect. And so here, there was slightly higher active carbon in wheat than Kernza across the 3 years when everything was pooled. And so that's a little bit perplexing. I haven't really thought about it too much. If anyone has any thoughts on why that might be occurring, my initial thoughts maybe just because we were sampling so shallowly while the Kernza roots are going deeper. There could be something going on there, but not what we expected to see really with the soil health at all, not much of an effect. And so the takeaways from this first experiment are that the Kernza was persistent and produced more total biomass than annual crops, but lower grain yields over time. ACE1 struggled overall and failed completely by the 3rd year. We did see that divergence in the weed communities, and Clover had a strong effect on suppressing weeds. Perennial grass weeds like roughstock bluegrass and timothy probably have the highest likelihood of becoming weed management challenges in Kernza, particularly because of there might be few selective herbicides that are able to control those, especially after a Kernza stand has been established. So that once you get that stand going and you don't really want to till it up and replant it, there might be some challenges in getting some weeds out of there if they do establish a foothold. And then finally, soil health had stronger effects by year than by crop species or intercropping treatments. So I would focus in here on this first point about lower grain yields that decline over time, because that really informed this second experiment using strip tillage to renovate mature Kernza stands. This decline is not unique to our experiment. It's been documented across basically every research project that's looked at Kernza over time. And this is not associated with plant mortality, as tiller counts and total biomass productivity are stable or increase over time, which is something we've also observed. So with that in mind, we thought about what might be causing that, and it seemed like maybe the Kernza itself was competing too strongly with itself. And so we thought that maybe using some disturbance in that system might give it a chance to regrow and produce more seed rather than vegetative biomass. So we tried 2 timings, fall and spring, and wanted to look closely at components of yield to see what the response to this disturbance might be. So really, this was just a deep ripping with a deep shank on the no-till planter, disturbing in pretty narrow strips, and a relatively low intensity disturbance, all things considered, compared to other things that people have tried with Kernza at least. This was a simpler experiment with just 3 treatments per block, the fall, the spring, and then the control treatments. And this was done in a 4th year Kernza stand. So it had been in the ground, had harvested 3 times. It had been planted in 2014, fertilized every year. Only 1 application of herbicide due to growing Canada thistle issue. And then with the zone builder, went in after that 3rd harvest, both in October and then the next April. That following August, at the 4th grain harvest, we did similar quadrat sampling as to the first experiment, but here we also sampled 20 spikes from each sample that were threshed by hand to count spikelets, florets, and seeds per spike. Everything else was also threshed to estimate total grain yield, and we used a similar mixed effect model with only tillage as a fixed effect here. So here, this photo I like. It's hard to see anything, which is actually, we almost didn't harvest this experiment at all because it didn't seem like anything different was going on in the treatments. But Chris took this photo on top of the combine because it seemed like there might have been something going on here in this fall treatment, maybe a slightly higher density of seed heads, while not much visually different between spring and control. But you couldn't really see that till you got up high on the combine. But it really did play out to be an interesting effect in the end. So first, when we looked at the components of yield, there was really strong consistency for spikelet count, for floret count, for seed count, and even for 1,000 kernel weight. So those within spike components of yield were not changing amongst any of these treatments. But when we look at the total biomass that was produced, so that all of the vegetative and above ground biomass in these plots, there was no difference between the control and the fall treatment. There was a decrease from that spring treatment. So maybe the disturbance there was a little too strong or too soon, close to tillering. Total tiller density was lower in both the fall and the spring treatment. So these are all stems in the plots. But when we look at reproductive tiller density, so those tillers that produce seed heads, we see a significant increase in the number of fertile tillers in a fall tilled plot. And this leads to about a 60% increase in overall grain yield, which is really outstanding, is really what we're looking for in using this management practice. And also in harvest index. So we had an increase in grain and a decrease in, or a slight decrease in total biomass. And so that harvest index is something we're really interested in at that point. So that was quick, but really the takeaway here is that this fall tillage disturbance did increase grain yield by a large amount at that following harvest. This was done in the 4th year. So by then the yield had declined substantially. And so the total grain production was still much lower than you would get from an annual. But it does provide insight into what might be going on in the field. Basically, that our assumptions of intraspecific competition is likely what's causing this change in the plant's reproductive output over time. With spring tillage, it did reduce stand density and biomass, but I didn't mention this on the data slide, but it did not impact grain yield. So the spring tillage didn't actually decrease yield in that year. And so you could think maybe in the future year that would have a similar increase effect, giving it time to regrow. And then really for the future, we would want to examine even more closely the timing, the intensity, and even the type of disturbance. So here we use strip tillage, and I know some of our collaborators in the Midwest have done things like grazing or using strip applied herbicides, but there could be even broader things to think about. So like crop residue burning and whether that stimulates tiller development, anything of that nature. And so really to wrap it up with hopefully a few minutes for questions, there's a lot of things going on in these perennial systems, and the complexity is higher for both us as researchers. There's a lot more things we are trying to figure out and manage here, especially with the novelty of these systems, like managing weed crop at different periods during establishment, during the post-harvest period, during subsequent years, and that crop competition with a perennial that's vigorous in growing vegetative biomass, but might need to be stimulated in some way to maintain its seed production over time. But the complexity of managing something for production of both grain and forage as well. So how do you balance that? Are there ways that managing maybe mowing at different points during the year, which is something we've looked at a little bit, might increase your forage productivity, but might decrease your grain yield? Is there a trade-off there? And how does that work out economically? And then to the point, we saw that through a 3-year period, there wasn't a strong effect on soil health, and there might even be wheat outperforming Kernza, maybe just because of wheat growing more vigorously over that period. But basically the takeaway there is restoring ecosystem services is not as simple as just growing a new crop. That these crops may have a lot of benefits, but they also need to be integrated into a system across many spatial and temporal scales, with interacting with many other components, and how you manage that is all tied up into what we actually can obtain from those systems, both in terms of material goods and other services. And there's a lot of room for improvement of these perennial cropping systems. I don't breed, but the breeders are still working on them, and so we'll be seeing improvement in their performance over time. And like these projects that I've been working on, the agronomic management will also have a significant impact on that. So while I would say that these might not be ready to put in the ground everywhere right now, this is a promising area of research, and hopefully within the next couple decades, we'll be seeing Kernza in our Cheerios. And then lastly, just acknowledging everyone. I have pictures of all of the technicians and field undergrad assistants that have helped over time. In particular, to Sandra, Chris, and Scott, who have done just so much. that long list of projects I worked on wouldn't be possible without all the contributions of all these folks. My committee, of course, and all the lab mates and fellow grad students that I've worked with over the years. And then all my external collaborators, starting with the farmers. We've got a great board of advisors, the folks at Wide Awake Bakery and Farmer Ground Flour on some of the economic side of things. And then external collaborators, other institutions working also on perennial grains. And then finally, just these funders that have so graciously allowed me to do this work. And took a little bit longer than I thought, but hopefully we have time for a little questions. I'm willing to stick around a little while if people want to ask me some stuff as well.
Great, thanks, Eugene. That was really a nice overview of the various projects you've been working on related to perennial grains. So let's open it up for questions. I know we have a little bit of time, but go ahead, unmute yourself, or go ahead, David.
Yeah, very interesting, Eugene. I really learned a lot. What is kind of the upper limit of where these yields could be, do people think? I mean, if you take a typical wheat yield, let's say 6 tons, or you're up in that 4 or 5, 6 tons or whatever, where do people think these could possibly get to if everything was right?
Yeah, well, so it's a bit of a tricky question due to just the time aspect of it. Or like, do you account that cumulatively over time, and how does that trade off? But currently, I mean, I don't want to put hard numbers on it, but you might expect, like, in the first year, maybe 25% of a comparable wheat, like we saw in that one experiment. And after that, we did see that sharp decline. There was a session at Tri-Societies last week on this, where there's sort of a bit of a debate between one of the main breeders of Kernza and then someone who's done a lot more work in more like perennial forages. And, there are life history trade-offs. So in order for a perennial to survive over winter, produce new stems the following year, it needs to dedicate energy to that. And an annual is really putting all of its energy into creating that seed, then dies, we harvest it, and we move on. So there might be a substantial trade-off there. We don't know how close we could get to an annual just based on that, but there's also the balance of photosynthetic production over the full course of the year. So with a perennial like Kernza, once it's established, the following year it's going to be starting growing much sooner than a spring wheat, because it's there as soon as the weather gets warm enough, whereas a farmer might have to wait for things to dry down and get the seed in. And it's there throughout the fall as well. So the total amount of photosynthetic radiation that's hitting that plant over the course of the year will be higher than the annual.
Yeah.
And so that might balance out some of these trade-offs. I think there's been studies done for perennial biomass feedstocks like miscanthus that show that their total net primary productivity is going to be much higher due to the higher amount of sunlight they can take in over the course of a year. Whether we can get the plants to put more of that towards seed production is the challenge, and how that balances out with the management of the system as a whole is where we would need to that's where we are moving forward, I guess.
Yeah. I was just kind of curious. I know all those other benefits, you laid that out very nicely, of the complexity and how it might use in a system. I understand all that. Yeah. It's just kind of wondering, if you were aiming for grain yield, how high do the breeders think? Could it end up being 50% of what we would otherwise would expect, or was it because you had very low yields, 250 kilograms per hectare of seed, and I'm not criticizing. I'm just kind of curious where the community thinks this could end up going. So that was my question about the seed.
Yeah, it's hard to speculate, I guess. I will say, I mean, one thing I didn't mention is that I've been working with these, like Kernza, for example, for 5 years. And when we planted that first experiment in 2016, it was cycle 3 breeding from the Land Institute. They're now on cycle 8. And I can say, just by going out to Kansas for conferences and stuff, that the difference in the plants in cycle 8 versus cycle 3 is just tremendous, in both the size of the inflorescences, the number of spikelets, and like all those components of yield, which I didn't find any difference in my experiment. Those over breeding cycles are increasing. So there's going to be a lot of advancement in that area. But yeah, in terms of what those newer cycles would produce in a like actual farm field at this point, I'm not sure.
Thanks, very clear.
Hi, thanks, Eugene. Very nice, clear presentation. I'm wondering, sort of from the systems perspective, whether you have thought about comparing with maybe sort of an optimized, a spatially optimized system using current, more commercial cultivars. So I'm thinking maybe strip cropping with corn grain and alfalfa, right? So you'd be getting forage production, you're getting grain production, you're getting perennials on half the land all the time. And I guess what I'm getting at here is, it seems to me that by doing some of that kind of practical optimization spatially, you might get many of the benefits that you're aiming to get by combining, trying to combine all the functions into one patch of land.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great idea. I know there's a lot of folks that have done that type of work and have looked at different cropping systems, sort of layouts, and I mean even in like Matt's lab with looking at different ways of using cover crops, right? There's different ways to try to put different functions back into the agro ecosystem, and I'm not saying here that perennial grains are the only way to do that. I just I think that it's promising because of like at that one point at the beginning, annual grains make up so much of the cropland that we have, and if we're ever gonna, we basically we need to do something there, right? And if we could somehow get perennial grains to the point where they're just as, to go to sort of David's point, they're just as productive in grain as the annual, and also producing forage and providing these other environmental services. It seems like that has that's sort of like a paradigm shift. And I completely agree. There's lots of ways to think about this, like the cropping systems we use and how we might innovate on them. I'm sorry, does that sort of like address that point, I guess?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I appreciate all the information. I guess I would maybe clarify what I was just trying to get at. Sure. is when we're comparing kind of alternative or what we hope are improved practices, I guess I would just encourage comparing that to kind of the top of the line management practice for current production systems, which might involve in some places strips of perennials and annuals, for instance, if there's an erosion issue, that kind of thing. So it's more just sort of thinking about what the baseline is that we compare, to.
Yeah, that's no, okay. That does help clarify things a little bit. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I would say that moving forward, I think that's an excellent place to think. At the start of this, we really didn't know what we were working with. And I think we just, to explain our thought process, is to try to keep things simple, and maybe not thinking so far down the road of like what is the most productive way to grow these, because we didn't really know, but also just trying to think of as our first baseline. It's like, well, if we have an annual or a perennial, like what are the differences? What's similar, what's different? And from moving from there to our next steps of trying to optimize that and tweak it further. And what's your next question that's revealed by some of those early results, I guess. But yeah, and I mean, I could probably talk for a long time about what I think we could do going forward. But yeah.
Eugene, this is Andy. I wonder if maybe as a follow-up to that, you could talk a little bit about the ecosystem services gains that you anticipate to be associated with the perennial system. You did a lot of work on soil health assessment, and there may be some reasons why you didn't see the difference based on the soil sampling depth. But I'm curious if you think about quantifying ecosystem services gains moving forward from these systems, what would you look at? And what kind of benefits do you think you'd see if you expanded the kind of quantification that you do?
Yeah. Well, so Well, what I'll say is just based on what some of my collaborators have done. They're seeing a lot of benefits in area where there might be nitrate leaching. So Kearns is able, with those deep roots, is able to like really prevent nitrate from getting down to the water table. There have been really good projects that have shown soil health benefits over time. Maybe we didn't have the length of time necessary, or maybe, like you said, sampling depth is an issue. I didn't talk about stratified sand of down half centimeters, and still processing some of that data to see if there's anything going on at depth there. I know that there's folks in Kansas doing things with like gas exchange and trying to better understand like air quality and greenhouse gas emissions and things from the system, doing like sort of a net balance of stuff in and out. And then, I mean, I guess wildlife and some work with Ducks Unlimited that and the NRCS, in sort of like conservation easements, and the possibility of even like having a conservation easement that you could harvest for grain if it's providing. So I guess this is a policy question. And don't want to go too far down that road, but like thinking about it, like if the plan itself is providing the benefits to the system that you want from a conservation easement in terms of providing wildlife habitat, protecting water, then why not harvest it if that's not going to do any damage, right? So that's just another way of thinking about integrating it into a system and thinking beyond like current boundaries to how that might fit in somewhere else. So I would say if my personal next steps forward, one thing that I've really started to focus on more is just weed management. Obviously, I'm in Tony's lab, so that's something we focus on a lot. But really, like we saw from that first experiment, like what if we had been able to manage weeds in Kearns in that first year and prevented them from getting that foothold that might have persisted throughout the whole experiment? And the same thing with the rye. If we had been able to maintain those decent rye yields from the first year through 3 years, then that's a really promising outcome. So over the past 2 years or so, we've been doing some competition studies, and also, like I mentioned, herbicide screening to try to. So I think in order to get any services out of the system, no matter what they end up being, we need to have a productive and effective system in general. So that includes all of these aspects. And so that's actually one of the reasons why it's so great to have such a great team of collaborators, both here at Cornell and at other places, is that different people are looking at different aspects of it, and we come together and try to figure out how to handle it all together.
I know we're getting past time, so if some people need to leave, Eugene, if folks have other questions, anybody, a burning question that you'd like to ask Eugene? Eugene, one quick question from me was, what do we know from the consumer side of things? Are folks willing to pay a little more? What are you kind of getting from those results?
Yeah, we're working on that paper with Miguel Gomez and Dyson, and so that we did. So what we did last fall, fall 2019, was a consumer preference testing. So basically, we brought in a bunch of people into a computer lab, gave them kernza bread, and then other breads, also very nice breads made by Wide Awake Bakery, and asked them what they liked about the sort of like the taste and other culinary qualities of the breads, and also what they would be willing to pay, both with only the taste and once we provided them with information about the potential environmental benefits of the crops that were used to create the bread. So we had kernza at different levels of flour incorporation, and then we had spelt as a comparison of sort of an interesting but maybe not as ecologically beneficial grain. And so the high level takeaways there are that people did not like the taste of kernza bread as much. And this is in a general consumer pool, and it's more branny. It might have a bit more of a grassy flavor, or sort of like nutty flavor. So some people like, I love it. I think it's great. I've eaten a lot of Kernza, but for the general consumer market, maybe not their taste. But when you do give them that environmental information, they were willing to pay more for the Kernza, and that's both with and without tasting. And so that's promising. How much more? I think was maybe like 5%. So with the yields, how low they are, you would still need to the production cost trade-off. That's something I'm working on in terms of the break-even analysis. Would need to be fairly high if you're only getting a 5% price premium at the market. But it is showing that there is some potential for almost thinking of it like a payment for services. If it's marketed right to maybe the right audience, it could have that benefit as well.
Okay. Michael, I see you have a chat question. Do you want to unmute and just ask it, or would you like me to read it off? Maybe you could just ask.
Sure. Hi, thank you very much. Maybe this is a little apropos of Peter Woodbury's question. I think of this as being part of a step towards these more complex polycultures, and I'm curious, I mean, that's sort of the original intention behind the programs at the Land Institute, et cetera. I'm curious, what are some of the more critical bottlenecks that resolving those would get us closer to the polyculture idea?
So I think that there's a couple of things. From an ecological perspective, we just need to do more work on finding the right mixes and the right sort of both spatial and temporal distributions, like how you combine that. So you could think of a polyculture in the field all at the same time or over time. Well, that's more of a rotation, but in thinking about like the large scale effect. Yeah, so basically figuring out which plants work well together and how they work together. And then the big challenge after that is how do I think harvesting is particularly challenging, especially if you're trying to get like multiple like if you're like we did one experiment with putting perennial grains and then field peas together and tried to harvest both of them together. And it was just really difficult, just the differences in sort of like the maturity timing and the height of the things you're trying to harvest and having the right machinery to do that. So I think even just that step of once you have a polyculture that where the plants actually get along is having a system that supports that in terms of the having machinery. I mean, even with Kernza by itself, we've struggled so much with just getting it combined and then processed. And we're using stuff that's designed for wheat, right? And Kernza is not wheat, but that's what's available to growers and even to us as researchers. So I think that's a big barrier. I think on one of my takeaway slides, the complexity is a big barrier. And so that's more of on an adoption side of things. That I think part of the reason that growers do things well that they do is because it fits within their job as a farmer, and like they have limitations in terms of their labor, their machinery, their land, and their time. And the more complex the system is, the more management it's going to take, and that would require more people doing it or more time in general. And again, with like the machinery aspect, if you do need specialized machinery to harvest from one of these systems in an efficient manner, then you're asking the farmer to go buy another piece of equipment, which can be incredibly costly. So like the simplification of agricultural systems is really at multiple levels it enables us to grow a lot on a lot of acres in using a lot of the same machinery and a lot of the same methods. And once you step outside of that, it just be like it's the extra effort to step outside of that is a little bit much for a lot of folks.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. I know we're way past time, so I would encourage anybody who's got some additional questions maybe to reach out to Eugene directly. Otherwise, Eugene, thanks that was a really nice talk covering a lot of, and there's a lot more behind all of that, obviously. So thanks again to all of you who hung in there.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.